Not Uncle Howard. Those were the words a bride expressed to her mother when they were going over the invitation list. They could only invite so many people because weddings are limited. They only had so much space. They only had so much money. And Uncle Howard, though she had loved him when she was a little girl, she had come to resent him. She had seen him at the family gatherings, at the family reunions, at Christmas. He would get drunk, and when he was drunk, he was mean. She didn't want Uncle Howard at her wedding. But her mother said, "He's your uncle. You have to invite him." And she said, "Well, maybe he won't show up anyway." But he did. He showed up and he took his seat. And immediately there were whispers going throughout the sanctuary. There's Howard. What is he going to do to mess this up? He was the wrong person to be there. Have you ever noticed in Scripture that Jesus often attracts the wrong people? Jesus is teaching, and a group of folks gather around him, and Scripture says that these are sinners and tax collectors. I mean, these are not the right folks. These are literally sinners. These are folks who are sinning against God and sinning against others. These are folks who are doing wrong in life and have no regard for that. These are tax collectors, those who are helping Rome, that oppressive government. And they are there, and the folks that are supposed to be there, the Pharisees, the teachers of law, that are on outskirts, they begin to gossip. Naturally, not even gossip, they begin to just outright criticize and condemn. Why does he let these folks come in and hear him? They are not supposed to be here. I mean, if you think about it, they kind of have a point. Someone once told me, we often lift up these sinners and tax collectors and we get on to these Pharisees for their criticism, but if you had to choose somebody to babysit your kids, would you put them over there with the sinners and tax collectors? Or would you want these upright Pharisees that try to obey the law? Probably the worst thing they would do would be to take your kid to synagogue. I mean, they're good folks. They're trying to do right. They're trying to obey God's law. The only thing that we can really say about them at this point is that they like to criticize. And they do that very well. They're very good at it. We who are upright church folks can do it too. We need to be careful that when we even criticize these criticizers that we are becoming like them, if you think through that. It is so easy to criticize and condemn. It makes us feel better. I mean, doesn't it? If you can find somebody that's a little worse off than you or doing something that will distract from you, and you can point and say, well, I'm better than him or I'm better than her. We all need someone to be better than. At least I'm not like that person. I remember years ago, got invited to a birthday party when I was in middle school. We called it junior high back then, but I remember it was the first one that we went to that there was actually going to be dancing. Caroline's parents had hired a band. It was literally a garage band. They put them in the garage, and we were all down there, and none of us knew how to dance. We didn't know what to do, so we just kind of moved around the best we could, and we were learning, and we had a good time. And Monday at school, I remember a boy named Brian. He was an acquaintance, not a close friend, but he walked to me and said, I heard you're at the dance. And I said, yeah, I was there. He said, I heard you danced really goofy. Kind of felt bad. I think I probably did dance pretty goofy. And I was upset for a while. And then at lunch, my friend Lynn, she came over. She said, what's going on? I said, well, Brian's telling everybody that I dance goofy. And I remember her wisdom. She said, "You know why he said that, don't you, Nelson?" I said, "No, I guess because I dance goofy, and now I'm going to be known as the goofy dancer all my life." She said, "He wasn't at the party, was he?" He said, "He heard you danced goofy." He's upset because he wasn't there. He's critical actually because he is jealous. And then my opinion of Brian changed a little bit. Instead of just being upset at his criticism, I began to think, well, gee, that must have felt bad not to be there with the rest of us. I kind of hate he was left out. Oscar Wilde said that criticism is the only reliable form of autobiography. In other words, when we criticize, or what we criticize tells more about ourselves and our state of being than it does about the other person. It usually tells that we are insecure about something, like my friend Brian. It takes attention off of ourselves, and it allows us to point elsewhere. As in Hamlet, methinks the lady does protest too much. When we over-function, when we over-criticize, it's because we're trying to draw attention away from ourselves. I remember one time a church member came up to me and said this in the hall, said, "Don't trust Tim." I said, "Okay." He said, "I told Tim something once personal, and he blabbed it all over the church. He'll blab and talk behind your back." And I thought, well, wait just a minute. What are we doing right here, right now? I'm not so sure about Tim, but I know I'm not going to tell you anything. Because when we go and we criticize and point at others, it's usually about something that we do. Have you ever noticed that the folks that bother you the most are really alike you? That those things that we don't like in ourselves, we point out and say, "Look at that. I don't like that." And the Pharisees did not like sinners. Pharisees didn't want to be sinners. They wanted to be righteous. They tried to do everything they could. They overdid it because no matter how hard they tried, they knew that they were sinners as well. No matter how much they overfunctioned, they had a hard time coming to grips with the fact that they were sinners. Sometimes in our self-righteousness, we forget. We forget that we are all sinners in need of God's grace. Maybe that's why Jesus earlier had said, "Don't judge, and you will not be judged. Don't condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. For with the same measure you pass out, it will come back unto you." Whatever you do to judge others will eventually come back upon you. What if instead of immediately practicing criticism and condemnation, like these Pharisees and like us, we decided that we would practice caring compassion? That when we saw someone that we thought was doing something wrong, instead of immediately jumping on them, we would begin to ask, why? Why are they doing this? What is it that's going on in their lives? What pain might they have that would cause them to act this way? If we were to do that, if we were to become caring and compassionate and be known as the most loving church in the community, guess what would happen? We couldn't keep them out. George Barna a few years ago did a study of why people don't come to church. He found folks that just don't want to come to church, and he asked them, and they gave him several reasons. They said, well, they're hypocrites there. Of course there are hypocrites in church. We're all sinners in need of God's grace. And then they said, well, church seems irrelevant to my life. And sometimes we can be that way. Others said, well, I would come, but there's no room for doubters, and I don't have all the answers. And Jesus certainly had room for doubters, letting them into his closest circle and letting folks deal with those deep matters of faith. Others says, I don't come because I don't find real community there. I don't come because I don't find a place to belong where folks can be honest with each other and we can pour out our hearts to one another. If that's not church, where could that be? And then they said this, and this one really bothered me. I don't go to church because I don't find God at church. I don't go to church because I find God in other places. I don't experience God's grace and God's Spirit within the church. And that speaks volumes. How could we, as God's church, not be the people of God? And maybe it's because we sometimes can be like those Pharisees, that instead of looking for God's grace in others, we tend to point out what is wrong instead of what is right. What if we, however, took these things and we turned them upside down and we became the most loving church? That we became a church where folks could come and they could express their doubts and they could say, I don't get all of this. And we'd say, that's right, we don't get it either, but we'll work together. What if we became a place of true community? That we came and that we could share our hearts, our failures and our successes. That we would do what Scripture says, that we would rejoice with those who rejoice and we would weep with those who weep. What if folks said, that church over there, that Rock Church, that First Baptist Church, it is a place where you can go and you can find God's grace. To choose instead of criticism and condemnation, caring and compassion. It doesn't take a lot to be caring and compassionate. When I was growing up, one of the ushers had a nickname. We called him the Gum Man. He had chewing gum. All you had to do as a kid would go over and say, hey, Mr. Gum Man, can I have a piece of gum? And he'd hand it to you. My mom went and asked the Gum Man one Sunday, he said, how in the world did you become the Gum Man? He said, well, my granddaughter came up to me one day and asked me for a piece of gum, and she had a friend with her, so I gave her a piece of gum too, and some other kids saw it and said, hey, do you have some gum for us? And then all of a sudden it just kept going. And now I have to go every Saturday and buy a big old pack of gum. Because all the kids just come up to me. I don't know how it happened. It just happened. I just did something nice, and it just kept going. What would it look like if we practice compassion? What would it mean? I think Jesus is telling us this morning that one thing it would look like is that we would recognize sin not just as sin and disobedience against God, but that sin is a form of lostness. That those who are caught up in sin are not our enemy, but rather they are those that Christ loves and died for. Sin is disobeying God, yes, but sin is also being lost. It is breaking away from God, and it is folks who are on the outside that need God's love and compassion. That's why Jesus told this story to the Pharisee about this shepherd. If he had 100 sheep and one of them got lost, he'd leave the 99, he'd go find the other, and I'd be sitting there as a shepherd saying, I'm not risk losing 99 for that one dumb sheep. Someone once said the way that sheep gets lost is that they nibble themselves lost. They just start nibbling away and they follow something. Isn't that how we all get lost in sin? We just do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and pretty soon we're out on the outskirts and lost. But what if we recognize sin as lostness, as folks in need of being found, in need of the good shepherd? And what if we valued these lost folks enough to go looking for them, to have compassion on them? It's not enough just to say we care. If we don't actually go and do something, if we don't actually leave our comfort zone with the 99 sheep and go out and search for someone. Some years ago when I was working with scouts, there was a Boy Scout that got lost up around Stone Mountain. He wasn't in our troop. He wasn't in a troop we knew. But we heard that he was lost and our troop was near there. And I remember we started talking and we got critical. Well, this is going to make all of us Boy Scouts look stupid. This is just going to be bad. The scoutmaster, he should have known. We would never let a kid run off and get lost. And our boys know better. If it was one of our boys, they know to find a clearing and sit down till we come and find them. We've taught them that. We said all that to make ourselves feel better, thinking that we might not ever lose a kid, knowing full well it could have been one of our boys. And then our scoutmaster, I remember, came over to us. He said, fellas, why don't we quit talking about them and go and help find that lost scout? He's one of us, and he's out there wandering around. And so that's what we did. Left our boys with someone to watch over them and went and helped in the hunt. To care enough to go, and then to welcome the lost back in to the fold. Cliff Richard was a British rock singer. You may not know him if you're too young to know, before the Beatles. Way back then, but you might have heard his songs, Devil Woman or We Don't Talk Anymore, but way back then, though if you look at his picture, he looks pretty clean cut. He was known as a bad boy of rock and roll. That was kind of his image. Parents said, don't listen to that stuff. But he became a Christian. And after he became a Christian, not only did he change his music, he began to go on mission trips. He writes in his autobiography about going to the Sudan to a refugee camp. And when he went in, he said he kept going over and washing his hands. Every time he got near somebody, he went over and washed his hands because it was a filthy, dirty place. And he didn't want to touch anyone because they were covered in dirt and they were covered in scabs. And the photographer that was there with him said, Cliff, go over and stand by that little boy. And he said he went over and he kind of bent down as close as he could to him without touching him because he didn't want to catch anything. About that time, someone stepped on the little boy's hand, and he screamed out, and Cliff just instinctively picked him up and grabbed him and pulled him in, forgetting about the dirt, forgetting about the scars, forgetting about that he might be sick and could infect him. He just held him until he stopped crying. And he said in that moment, he realized what it meant to be a true Christian. For despite our sin, Christ calls us and picks us up and takes us into his heart. To welcome the lost. What makes you feel welcome? Do you realize how intimidating it is for anyone to come and visit a church, not just our church, any church, to go by yourself? That's why most folks that come to church usually come with a friend, with a guest. That's the best way to get folks here is to invite them, to be with them. But just to walk into a church where you know no one, you're new in the community, maybe it's been a long time since you did that because you have a place of belonging here, but it can be frightening and intimidating, and you look around and you hope to see someone that you know, or at least that is a friendly face. We go and we look for the lost. We provide a welcome for them. And we celebrate not just when folks visit our church, but when folks' lives are changed. Jesus didn't just tell one story here. When the Pharisees were critical about these sinners, these tax collectors, he tells them three parables. He tells them this story about this lost lamb, and he tells them a story about a woman who loses a coin and turns her house upside down, and then he tells them a story about a lost son. We call him the prodigal son. There is something that unites these three stories, and that is at the end of each story, it's the same conclusion. Jesus says the person who has lost the thing calls everybody together and says, "Come celebrate, for what was lost is now found." Will we rejoice with others? Have you ever noticed on the front of our hymnal, the name of our hymnal is Celebrate in Grace? We sing hymns of celebration because God is gracious to us, that when we were lost, Jesus came to find us and now calls us to seek and to save that which is lost. You remember Uncle Howard? He showed up to the wedding, and he showed up sober. He showed up clean cut. He sat in the back trying not to distract from the wedding. When they went to the reception, he went back in the kitchen and started helping back there because he didn't want to get out and mingle with the rest of the family. He knew he wasn't welcome. A couple of family members went back in the kitchen and said, "Howard, what are you doing back here?" And he said, "I know it. I know I've messed up. I know I've embarrassed this family before, and I don't want to mess up my niece's wedding. I just want to be here to celebrate it with her." And they said, "Well, come out. Come out. Come be a part of us." And the bride saw him, and she remembered that uncle from when she was a little girl, the one that she saw again with fresh eyes. And she went and gave him a kiss and said, "Uncle Howard, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you're here today."